5:30, so I will get this started. And as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, but I'll mention this again to late arrivals, this class will take anywhere from 1 to 3 hours, but that will depend on how many people are following along, how quickly people catch on to things, and how much time it just takes. I highly recommend that people follow along, but it's not required, and this will also be recorded, so we'll have that available for people to watch later on. Now, unlike some classes, you'll notice this is not being held in the classroom. This is being held in a big open area. And the reason for that is because we need space to see, and we also are going to want to have the ability to let you build anything that you need to. So, the first steps, setting the area. Most of you probably already know that if you use the WASD or the arrow keys, your avatar moves around. Now, one of the things that's very useful is you can also use these while you are building. However, to do so, you have to be sitting down. So, first step off, everybody just go ahead, spread out a little so you have space to work, and just have a seat. It could be on the ground. If you want, you can res out a Prim and sit on a Prim, pull out a chair, whatever you feel is most comfortable. In Second Life, normally your camera is based on your avatar. If you hit Control and Alt and then click on something, you can now lock your camera onto a point other than you and move it around. With this, because you're sitting, once you have it locked on, WASD and arrow keys will also move that camera around even if you aren't continuing to hold your mouse button. This is useful because you can also move your camera in very close to what you're doing and not have your own avatar constantly getting in the way of what you're seeing. So, we'll start this off. Right click on the ground somewhere and select Build. And you can now pull out any old object. It can be square, cylinder, sphere, whatever you'd like. The basic prims are all there. And with Second Life, it will default to 1/2 meter or 0.5. And missing one piece of my program. There we go. A big square here. Set it up right behind me. So with this, with your camera locked onto your prim, you can zoom in, pan around, do whatever you need. If you're selecting Edit, you'll notice there will be 3 sets of arrows. Hopefully nobody here is colorblind, because that'll make this very difficult. These arrows correspond to the world grid, which is the literal X, Y, and Z axis of Sims, not the object. By clicking and holding on one of these arrows, you can move it in any of these directions. Also on this, you'll see these little corner triangles. Holding one of those will lock it onto a flat plane, allowing you to move it on the other 2 directions at once. And this big square behind me, I will try to keep a running tally of reference images in case you need to see what is going on. We'll get to sculpts later in Gaida. And there's somebody else has a assistant thing going on here as well. Who's this? So, with locking your camera on your object, you can now zoom in close. You can see under it. and you can move all around. Now we have the grid. If any of you have worked with other programs, you may have noticed a thing called snapping. Second Life has this as well, and it is one of the most useful features that a lot of people don't know about. Pull up the picture here. Which one is it? So on the picture behind me, you'll notice there is a grid of lines around the object. If I go into the editing options, which you can see on this picture behind me, no, it's not on the other one. Let's pull up the correct picture for that. Which, come on, Second Life, you can do it. No, come on. There we go. Big picture behind me. Up at the top, you'll see some settings, like stretch both sides, stretch textures, snap. We'll be going over most of those things as we go on, but we'll start off with snapping. So if you click the options button right next to that, you'll be able to set how big of a snapping you want, and this is again in meters. Setting a large number like 1 or zero point 0.5 means that objects will snap into position at every meter or half meter. Setting it something smaller like zero point 0.1 is every tenth of a meter, and you can go all the way down to every centimeter, which is 0.010. The larger you have this set, the more quickly you can align things. The more small you have this set, the more detailed and specific you can have things. You can additionally free slide by clicking and holding. To use the snapping, as you slide or rotate, you'll see an inverted ladder appear around your object. Simply keep your mouse inside the center of that channel to free move in any position you want, or if you are clicking and holding to drag and you move it outside, it will now lock into positions along that grid. This works on sliding. If you hold down Control, you'll also notice rotation rings appear, again in the three colors. The grid also applies to rotating, and you have individual lock-in positions on rotations as well. One of the other useful things a lot of people don't know is if you hold Shift and move something, it makes a copy. The object that you had originally stays in place. The copy is the one that moves. If you combine that with the grid, you can quickly do things like make an array.
This is fun. Oh, sorry.
Oh no, it's fine if you talk, just generally try to keep it down to reasonable amounts. If anybody has questions, also feel free to ask. Just try to wait for me to finish a sentence or finish what I'm explaining, because the answer to your question might already be coming. And where's my picture? There we go. If you have multiple objects and you select them, you will notice that the cursor is in one of two places. It'll either be in the center of one of the objects, or it will be centered between them. This is the Edit Axis at Root option, which is selectable. On the picture behind me, you'll see the same two objects selected. One with Edit Axis at Root turned on, you'll notice the selection arrows are in the middle of one, and the other, it's between the two. The reason this is helpful is you can also combine that with positioning and rotating. If I have Edit Axis at Root on and I rotate these two objects, I can start doing things like making an array that's circling. Whereas if I have it turned off and I do the same, I get the same effect, but now instead of rotating around that one object, it rotates around the center between them. Both of these settings, as you can imagine, have different purposes and uses. That's fine, Lily. Where did we lose you? I can back up and cover something again. And also, I apologize. I have not taught a group this large before. I'm usually only teaching 1 to 2 people at a time. So I will try to pay attention to what everybody is building, but I may lose you from time to time. All right. So as I was mentioning, if you have an object and you hold shift and you slide it, it will make a copy. This also works if you are selecting multiple things. However, one of the interesting quirks about Second Life is that the undo system is based per item. So I can take these two, hold shift to drag them to make another. If I hit Control Z or the undo shortcut, it puts them back where they were. And then I can rotate them to a new position. And do it again, and again, and again. I see some people have already started going off tinkering with texturing. I got at least one person messing with the Prim features such as physics. These will be things that we all cover, but don't worry too much. I know that's one of the major things about this class is if you've ever heard the term pictures are worth 1,000 words, I could tell you all day long about the different features. I encourage people to follow along because actually poking a setting and seeing what it does will make you understand better than me just telling you. On the subject of the undo system, using undo will revert quite a number. Like it keeps a very long list of changes that you've made, all the way up till you've created that or until you've logged in. However, it will only save some types of changes. It will keep a history of position changes, size changes, and rotations. It will not undo changes to texture, color, prim type, deformations, or special features such as gravity. So you can use that, for instance, to, I'm just going to take this piece, make it really big. I can then just undo, and it shoots right back to where it was. So now that we've covered the basics of moving prims and things of sorts like moving them, rotating them, we can cover actually changing the prims themselves. When you are just generally editing a prim, it will normally default to the move setting. If you change it to manually rotate or stretch in the window, or you can also hold down Control or Control and Shift. You'll notice that the cursor over your items changes. Control pulling up the rotation rings. Control and Shift will change the arrows to be points on each side of the object's X, Y, and Z axis. Or you'll also notice little white dots at each of the corners. By clicking and dragging one of these, you can change the size or scale in a specific direction, with the white corner dots changing it overall, and the individual colored ones changing it on that direction only. And I will specify this is the object's X, Y, and Z sizes. If you have something rotated at a funky angle compared to the grid, it will still use that specific object's X, Y, and Z dimensions, not the grid. So a square will always be a square, or a rectangle, or a sphere will remain sphere-ish. There are some ways around that. I'm just going to hold Control and hit Z a few times and revert it all back through all the way to being a square again. You can do whatever you'd like. During a class, will just delete everything except one and go back to one item from time to time. I'm just going to take a look around. Let's see. So Rose has worked out a radial array of boxes around a sphere. Good. And looks like you've got a texture grid on there. Those are helpful. Let's see. Piano's got a bunch of pictures that he's offset and arrayed. Good. Rosie has found the twist options, it looks like. Got some textured, like, glass-looking cubes over there. And brain rot is starting to deal with other shapes and deformations. Good. And that's the big thing, as you guys are exploring. There are a lot of things that, as I said, me explaining it is not going to be nearly as good as you experimenting. And as weird as it sounds, some of the things I've already told you about, there are professional builders in Second Life that never learned. There are a lot of people that got in and they just went straight to mesh building or straight to sculpting, and they never learned the basics. They never learned how to align things to the grid. And there are some interesting things you can do that, for instance, by just holding shift and drag and changing the prim type. Yes, I can make multiple objects really quickly. Also using the grid, I can make these objects all align to each other. So they will be exactly placed instead of just eyeballing them or having to do a lot of complicated math. I can just put them where they're supposed to go and be done. And as some people have started to explore, there are deformations. While you are editing in the edit window, you'll notice the expanded window below. If you don't have it, you'll see a bar with a little downward arrow that you can expand the window, and that will show you the extra properties of that primitive item or prim. These include name, sale price, physics, size, the deformations, features like flexi prims and lighting, texturing, and even what is inside it for content. And this is used for things like scripting. Now, inside these, let's start off with the deformations. I'm going to knock this down to a cube once again. And each prim has these settings, but on some of them, the same setting will act differently, even if the prims look to be the same. So I have a cube. If I use the path cut, or just cut, depending on which client you use, they sometimes change terms, which, as you can imagine, gets incredibly annoying to try to explain to somebody. Path cut is like slicing a cake. On most prims, it'll have a single point in the center, and it'll be slicing through the object. And if I have a sphere, a cylinder, and a cube, all path cut in the same exact settings, you'll notice they're cutting in different directions.
Oh, I forgot about that.
So Lily has, looks like a cylinder. They've twisted and path cut it and hollowed it. Good. You're testing out different things. And yes, there are a lot of features that most people never even really look into. And that's why this is a 101 class that, I'll be honest, I use a lot of these things, but there are some things in here I can openly say I've never found a need. But they're there. But when you start getting into things like the deformations, cuts, twisting, it's time to start discussing poles. Now, hopefully none of you are flat earthers. You understand how the world works, a globe. We have latitude and longitude, where from north to south, all the lines converge at the north and south poles. This is also how Second Life textures. If I have a sphere and I throw a texture on it, I can throw the same texture on a cylinder and a box. And now this is the exact same texture on three different objects. You'll notice on the sphere, it's coming to points on either side, and then the rest of it, its straight lines are going around. On the cylinder, it's still doing straight lines up and down and then across, but the top and bottom are just textured flat and rounding corners. And on the box, you can see it's just a flat square on each side. However, if I take the cylinder and instead change it into a tube, you'll notice things get a little weird. The sides are still going the same, but the ends are now using that same stitching point similar to the sphere. And a lot of people would say, oh, the tube, that's just a cylinder. And for the most part, it is, other than the ends. However, as I mentioned, the deformations act entirely differently. You now have a thing called hole size. The hole size acts similar to hollowing does on a cylinder. But then the hollowing on a tube now hollows inside that ring, and the cutting cuts sideways. So a tube will act entirely differently than a cylinder, depending on what orientations and what settings you use. Yet, when you have them just base shapes, they look the same. They act mostly the same. And this is where the tube and the cylinder in building act entirely different from each other. With the box, you also have the prism, which is a triangle in shape instead of a box. Whereas if I take that box and I just try to taper it instead, it doesn't quite work the same. You get the same general shape, but the texturing is different. If I go to make any deformations, such as cuts, hollowing, they now act differently once again. So have I lost anybody? Is anybody still generally keeping up?
A little.
Looking around, it's good. A lot of people are tinkering with additional pieces, changing shapes, working on deformations. Good. Circle thing from earlier. The arrays. All right, I can swing back to that as well. So if you look over at what Rose was working on there, you'll see they've got a bunch of boxes arrayed around a sphere. Now the way they did that is with one item, you can hold shift and drag, and you now have two objects. If you select both of them, you'll notice that your selection cursor with the colored arrows, if you have edit axis at root turned on, is inside whichever object you selected last. And you can do this with shift clicking or control clicking, or just dragging a big box and selecting everything. With edit axis at root turned off, it will find the spot that it considers to be the center of all the selected objects, and it will rotate around that. Right now, these four spheres, I have edit axis at root turned off, and I'm just rotating and letting go every now and then. And you'll notice all four spheres are rotating around some nebulous, invisible middle point that Second Life has said this is the center of all of these objects. If I then turn on edit axis at root and do the same thing, it's now rotating around one of them. That is the one that I had selected last as the root prim. Combining this with what I had mentioned about being able to drag to make multiple objects and the undo system, I can drag a second set, so I now have 8 spheres, undo to put them in the same location, and then rotate the new set. And one of the major benefits of this is you can intentionally create a point to rotate around. And you'll notice things I've done in the past, like a bandolier belt of bullets, where you have the big strap, you've got a bunch of bullets. Those aren't individually placed. Instead, I found the center of what I wanted to. I made one bullet, and then I had just a sacrificial throwaway prim in the middle that I had as a center. And I would create a new bullet and then use that centerpiece to rotate it into the next position. And again, and again, and again, creating a bunch of bullets that were all on an arc. By doing that, you could have a clean, even curve. How far apart they are sets the radius of that curve. And so you can make a really broad, gentle curve by making it really far away. Or you can have a very tight, aggressive, angled by having them close together. Also, with the grid and the rotations, if you notice, the rotations in Second Life are based on fractions. So if I'm holding down one of these rings and I can see I have up, down, north, south, or up, down, east, west, depending on which of the colored rings I'm doing. If I'm holding the flat one, it'll be north, south, east, west, based on the Second Life world grid. But then also, with the grid on, the little tick marks, I can go to a 45-degree angle, which is a 1/8 of a turn. I can go to a 22.5, which is a 16th of a turn, 30 seconds, 60 fourths. I can split that multiple times. And the reason that's useful is I can say, I want to have 4 of these. Well, I can just drag them to the 4 positions. If I want, for instance, 8 of them, I can take those 4 and then just rotate them that eighth of a turn to make 8 of them. You can also, if you have 2 items linked, to do so, you would select multiple prims, multiple objects, and again, the last one that you select will be designated as the root. That is the point that Second Life will use for where scripts are, where it rotates around if using edit axis at root, what it's named. All of that is determined by whichever the root prim is. So I select some prims, select the center of this last. Up in the build menu, or using Control L, I can link them together. Second Life now considers them to be one object of multiple pieces. In the expanded build menu at the bottom, instead of just using the grid and rotating, or resizing, or positioning, I can also type in numbers. For instance, I'm going to take this and delete all these extras. And with this, I can now say, I want this X to be 90 degrees. And it'll just instantly change the entire object based on the rotation of that center by 90 degrees. This will allow you to, and is that Foxyana doing that? Yes, thank you for following along with the little arrow thing. That is something I'll
Yeah,
have to consider for if I have to teach the class again, is making one of those boards with an arrow myself.
yeah.
And with that, you can rotate by unusual amounts. That is helped by, here we go, this little chart here. As I said, Second Life does things like rotations and sizes fractionally, or by decimals. And the metric system is innately a decimal system, whereas imperial, feet and inches, is a fractional system. However, in Second Life, you kind of have to combine the two, where you will have fractional amounts of a metric system. Or in imperial, American, whatever you want to call it, other with feet and inches, you're used to fractional amounts, but decimal inches and decimal feet still exist. So I have a chart here, and did I delete the box? I deleted the box, okay. I have a folder of useful tools, including the slide pictures of all of this and some other things for giving away to anybody at the end. And this image is one of it, where we have decimal to fraction conversions. For instance, 11/16 is 0.6875. Seems like an odd number to remember, but it all boils down to how fractions work. 1/8 of an inch, or 2/16, is 0.125. Quarter is 0.250, which is twice as much. Basic math. But knowing these amounts, you can also know things like decimal amounts of degrees. A 1/4 turn is 90 degrees. Well, half of that is 45. Half of that is 22.5. Half of that is 11.25. And you can, knowing these amounts, you can set specific repeatings, like a gear. If you, for instance, want to have 5 pieces, well, you have the normal 360-degree circle. divide 360 by 5, and you now know I have to rotate by this many degrees to make 5 things evenly spaced in a circle. And you can do that with most general round numbers, but if you want to have 23 teeth on a gear, it is going to be a bit more interesting math to make that work, because that's not really a clean number to work with.
Hmm. Sorry.
And lost my place in my notes. Oh, that's because I'm out of notes. Okay. So from here on out, does anybody have any specific questions on what we've already covered? Things that you need me to repeat, questions where you had a thought, well, if this happens, what about this? Anything like that.